In the stillness of midday at the cemetery, where sounds were scarce, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder and louder. Soon, a group of men arrived at the cemetery, led by four carrying a coffin, and in front of them was another man who seemed to be their guide. They continued walking through the cemetery until their guide pointed to a grave. Without hesitation, they lowered the coffin. As one of the men prepared to open the coffin to bury the deceased, the cemetery caretaker, who had already prepared the grave, noticed something strange and unsettling. Each time one of the men attempted to open the coffin, it would shut again. A chill ran through the caretaker's body, even though it was broad daylight. He turned to the men, confused by what was happening, but found them eerily cold-hearted, their gazes fixed, and they remained silent. This unnerved him further, as if nothing unusual was happening. Annoyed, the caretaker approached the coffin and opened it himself, saying sarcastically, "How long are we going to stay like this? Come on, help me lower it into the grave." Two of the men assisted him, and together they lowered the coffin into the grave. As the caretaker climbed out of the grave, he glanced at the deceased with a peculiar look, one that hinted at something ominous and far from reassuring. Once he was out, he turned around, but the men were gone. He looked left and right but saw no trace of them. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. On his way home, he continued looking back, hoping to spot them, but they were nowhere to be found. The caretaker lived nearby, in a small room at the entrance of the cemetery with his wife and children, provided to him so he could better guard the cemetery against thieves. As he entered his room, just before locking the door, his wife asked, "How much did they pay you?" Smiling, he replied, "They didn't pay me anything. As soon as I finished my work and went back to them, they were gone. They must have run away to avoid paying me. But forget about that. The dead man himself will pay me tonight." His wife screamed at him, not scolding but in desperation, "Won't you ever change your ways? How long will you keep this up? Won't you stop until you bring disaster upon your children? The villagers trust you to guard their dead, yet you rob them yourself." He grabbed her arm tightly, making her wince in pain, and whispered, "You talk too much. And you haven't even prepared the food yet. Go and make it now." Later that night, just before dawn, the caretaker opened the door of his room, carrying a lantern to light his way. He walked to the cemetery and found the grave of the newly buried man. He opened the grave, holding the lantern, and descended the steps. The same shiver ran through his body, but he ignored it, dismissing his body's warnings. Turning to the corpse, he grinned wickedly, unwrapped the shroud, and left the body exposed. He searched the body thoroughly, flipping it from side to side, hoping to find something valuable. He had often come across such fortunate coincidences that pleased him in the past. However, this time, he found nothing. As he stood up, the light from his lantern reflected off something in the corpse's mouth, a shiny golden tooth. The glint captivated him, drawing him closer. If only he had ignored his greed. He pulled a sharp tool from his pocket, one he kept for such lucky encounters, and leaned toward the corpse to extract the tooth. He succeeded in removing it but was met with a sight that froze his blood. The corpse's eyes were wide open, staring directly at him. Fear gripped his heart, but he quickly rationalized it, telling himself such things had happened to him before and there was no need to panic. But what happened next? He pulled a sharp tool from his pocket, one he reserved for such fortunate occasions, and leaned closer to the corpse to extract the tooth. He succeeded, but what he saw next froze him in terror. The corpse's eyes were wide open, staring directly at him. Fear surged through his heart, but he quickly reassured himself that such occurrences were not uncommon and there was no need to panic. However, what happened next shook him to his core. Fixating his eyes on the corpse's gaze, his hand tugged at the shroud beside the body. Suddenly, The corpse's eyes darted toward his hand and the shroud with astonishing speed. But the caretaker was quicker, fleeing the grave without looking back. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him until he reached his room. Once inside, he bolted the door behind him, collapsing onto the floor, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with shock, and his entire body trembling. His wife, alarmed, asked, "What happened to you to make you like this?" The only words he could muster were, "The dead man woke up." He repeated the phrase over and over until the sun rose, painting the sky golden and blending its rays with the earth. At that moment, he suddenly remembered the grave he had left open. If anyone were to see the exposed corpse, naked and uncovered, there would be no one else to blame but him, the cemetery caretaker. The villagers trusted him with their dead, and if they discovered something amiss, all their suspicions would fall on him. Reluctantly, he gathered his courage and headed back to the grave. Along the way, his inner voice urged him to return home, but his rational mind forced him forward to inspect the grave and close it tightly, avoiding any potential scandal. When he arrived, his body trembled once more, overtaken by the same shiver as before. With great effort, he descended the stairs into the grave. What he found below truly terrified him. The corpse was wrapped in its shroud as if it had never been disturbed. Its eyes were wide open, staring lifelessly. He instinctively reached into his pocket, pulling out the golden tooth he had taken from the body earlier. If he weren't holding it in his hand, he might have convinced himself that the entire ordeal was nothing more than a hallucination. He exited the grave, sealed it tightly, and returned to his room. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but when night fell, blanketing the world in darkness, the caretaker sat with his wife and children, eating dinner. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. He stood up to answer it, but when he opened the door, no one was there. Confused, he returned to his seat. His wife asked, "Who could be knocking at this hour? Is there another deceased person they want you to bury?" He replied, "There wasn't anyone at the door." But just as he sat back down, the knocking came again. This time, he walked to the door cautiously, but once again, no one was there. It happened a third time, and by then, the caretaker was fuming. Sensing his anger, his wife patted him on the back to calm him and offered to open the door herself. When she opened it, she found a black cat with strange, piercing eyes. She couldn't explain the shiver that ran down her spine at the sight of it. Internally, she sought refuge in God. Something about the cat unnerved her, but she hid her fear from the rest of the family. The black cat's unsettling gaze was fixed on the caretaker, never wavering. Its eyes were filled with a threatening intensity, as if delivering a silent warning. The wife returned and sat between her husband and children, but she couldn't shake her unease about what had happened. Could this be an omen of misfortune heading their way? Not wanting to spread fear among her family, she chose not to mention the incident and pretended to eat with them. The next day, news reached the caretaker that he needed to prepare for an incoming coffin. Dutifully, he went about his work, performing the necessary tasks. However, as he finished and went to collect his payment, he felt as though time itself had frozen. There, among the living, he saw the dead man whose golden tooth he had stolen. The man stared at him with a chilling smile that sent shivers down his spine. The men around him noticed his sudden change in expression. His eyes widened in terror, and sweat began to pour down his face. Even when the deceased man's son extended his hand to pay him, he stood frozen for several minutes, unable to acknowledge the gesture. It was as though he didn't see the money or the man offering it. One of the men asked, "What's wrong? Did you see something that frightened you that much?" The caretaker took the money shakily but said nothing. His eyes darted around, searching for the dead man, but he was nowhere to be found. He returned to his room, deeply troubled and distracted. What had happened? He had worked as a cemetery caretaker for many years and had never experienced anything like this. Could it really be that the dead man had awakened to haunt him? This time, the caretaker refrained from disturbing the corpse further. The fear of encountering the vengeful dead man again paralyzed him. Each time the image of the man's terrifying face and piercing gaze came to mind, he felt as though his heart might leap from his chest in sheer terror. Days passed, and no further incidents occurred. Over time, the caretaker began to forget the horror he had felt, convincing himself it had all been a trick of his imagination. Life seemed to return to normal. One day, the wife went to the market to buy supplies. She was so focused on ensuring she didn't forget anything that she accidentally bumped into an elderly woman, barely able to walk. The old woman fell to the ground, and the wife hurried to help her, apologizing profusely for not noticing her. As the wife helped her up, the old woman grabbed her hand, leaned in, and whispered, "Tell him, daughter of her mother's name, that the dead have their dignity, and it must not be violated." The wife froze in fear at the chilling message. As the old woman walked away, the wife's eyes followed her, but in an instant, the woman vanished, disappearing in a way that defied all logic. Terrified, the wife abandoned her shopping and rushed home to warn her husband. She was a stranger to the village, and no one knew her family. How did that old woman know her mother's name? The wife realized something was truly wrong and felt the need to warn her husband, urging him to abandon the path he had taken. Upon reaching home, she dropped everything in her hands and began searching for him, calling his name. He wasn't there. She went outside and called for him several more times before he finally appeared. "Wife, haven't you had enough of what you're doing? Tell me, what do you want to happen to us? Don't you see that you have a wife and children? Do you not fear for us? Husband, what happened to you to make you so hysterical?" "Wife, I bumped into a strange old woman at the market. She warned me about your actions. She told me to tell you that the dead have their dignity, and you cannot violate it. Haven't I spoken to you about this over and over again? Look at yourself. Now she knows about my mother, and soon the whole village will know what you've been doing to their dead." He placed his hand over her mouth and whispered, "Are you mad? No one has ever seen me. Who is this woman, and how does she know such things about me?" "Wife, I don't know how she knows. But she even knows my mother's name." "Husband, that's strange. How could she know that? We're strangers here, and no one knows us." "Wife, my heart tells me something is terribly wrong." He placed his hand over her mouth and said, "Have you lost your mind? No one has ever seen me. Who is this woman, and how does she know these things about me when she hasn't even seen me?" The wife replied, "She knows, somehow she knows. She even knows my mother's name." "Strange," he muttered. "How could she know that? We are strangers here, and no one knows us." The wife said, "My heart tells me that something is wrong." "Why do you feel that way?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, "but something isn't right. Please, I beg you, turn away from this path. Otherwise, your secret will be exposed, and we will all pay the price." His face grew tense, and he burst out angrily, "Don't you dare bring this up again. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I don't need anyone meddling in my affairs. Do you understand?" She said nothing more, picked up the groceries she had brought from the market, and headed to the kitchen. But her face showed signs of deep anguish, as though she was helpless against what was happening. Days passed, and life resumed its rhythm. The incident was forgotten amid daily routines. Then came the next burial. The caretaker performed all his duties without any issues, complications, or strange occurrences, but, as usual, his habit only paused for a short time. He took his lamp and slipped out of the house just before dawn. He looked around cautiously to ensure the road was empty. Once he felt reassured, he headed to the new grave. Descending the stairs, he placed his lamp on the ground and began removing the shroud from the deceased. As he worked, he suddenly heard his wife calling him. "Hurry up," she called. "I need you." "All right, I'm coming," he replied. That he grabbed the shroud and left the grave. When he looked around, he saw no one. Thinking she had returned to their room, he turned back to close the grave, but as he turned his back to his home, he heard the voice again. This time, it was softer, almost a whisper. Slowly, he turned around, and what he saw left his eyes wide with terror. Standing before him was a woman cloaked entirely in black. His heart froze with fear. This wasn't his wife. The figure's height and body didn't match hers, yet the voice was identical. He stared at her, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. She stepped closer, one slow step at a time. That's when he noticed something odd. She was limping. The closer she came, the more he observed, aided by the light of his lamp. His heart sank when he realized her feet weren't human. Instead, they were the hooves of a goat, large and horrifying. Every step she took revealed more of her nightmarish appearance. Paralyzed with fear, he couldn't move, speak, or even scream for help. She came closer still. When only a few steps separated them, her voice changed, becoming deep and terrifying. She opened her pale, white eyes and screamed, "Give me back what's mine." At that moment, he lost all control of himself and ran wildly through the cemetery, like a madman. Her voice echoed around him, following him wherever he went. Somehow, he managed to reach his home. Slamming the door shut behind him, he collapsed inside, trembling. His face was pale, drained of all color from the sheer terror of what he had just encountered. His wife, awakened by the loud noise of the door, came out and asked, "What's wrong? Why do you look so pale?" He said nothing. He only stared at her silently, then dragged himself to bed. Exhausted and overwhelmed, he fell into a deep sleep, as though trying to escape the horrors of the night in his dreams. His wife, awakened by the loud slam of the door, asked, "What's wrong? Why do you look so pale?" He didn't respond. He only stared at her, then dragged himself to bed and fell asleep, as if seeking refuge from something immense and terrifying. But how could sleep free him from the overwhelming fear that consumed him? His mind was haunted by the figure of the woman, who seemed to appear everywhere he looked. Every time he turned, her image loomed in every corner of his room. Concerned, his wife approached him again, determined to uncover what had shaken him so deeply. Finally, he broke his silence and confessed everything. Hearing his story, she felt the fear creeping into her heart. She looked around nervously, then began reciting verses from the Quran, including the Muawwidatayn and Ayat al-Kursi. Her panic grew, and she screamed, "You must go to a sheikh immediately and tell him about all these strange things happening to us. Don't take this lightly." He shouted back at her, his voice echoing with frustration, "Have you lost your mind, woman? Do you want me to tell a sheikh that I dig up graves, steal shrouds, and leave the corpses exposed? And that because of my actions, a dead man and the jinn are after me?" In a softer tone, she replied, "No. I didn't mean that. Just tell him about the jinn that's tormenting you, and the old woman I encountered at the market. Don't mention the theft at all." The next morning, the caretaker brought a sheikh to their home. He told him about the strange occurrences, leaving out the details of his grave robbing. The sheikh listened attentively and then asked, "Have you done anything to harm them? Perhaps poured hot water in the bathroom or disturbed them in this room? Your room is part of the cemetery, after all." The caretaker replied nervously, "No, I haven't done anything like that." The sheik paused, then said, "Jinn do not harm people unless they are provoked or if something that belongs to them is taken." The caretaker's face turned pale, and sweat dripped from his forehead. His wife noticed his unease. The sheik reassured them, "Don't worry. By Allah's will, I will do what I can to protect you, your wife, and your children from harm." The sheik recited Quranic verses and sprinkled water he had blessed throughout the house. Once he was done, he left. The caretaker felt a sense of relief and calmness for the first time in weeks. That night, he finally managed to sleep. But he wished he hadn't done. As soon as he drifted into slumber, he heard a voice calling him from outside. Jolted awake, he got up and followed the sound. The closer he got, the louder it became. Finally, he found the source. It was his eldest son, a 17-year-old boy, calling out for him. Desperate to find him, the caretaker searched everywhere. He finally traced the voice to a sealed grave. Panicking, he opened it and descended the steps, only to find a corpse wrapped in a shroud lying before him. Yet, his son's voice continued to echo, calling for help. Frantically, he began untying the shroud, reassuring his son that he was there and everything would be okay. But when he unwrapped the shroud completely, it was empty. Suddenly, the caretaker heard loud, menacing laughter. He turned to the entrance of the grave and saw the same dead man with the golden tooth. Their eyes met, and the corpse gave him a sinister smile before saying, "Gone and at peace." The laughter grew louder and louder until it echoed in every corner of the grave. The caretaker woke up in a state of sheer terror, realizing it had all been a nightmare, but the sound of screaming pulled him back to reality. This time, it wasn't a dream. Rushing outside, he found his wife in the cemetery, holding their son's lifeless body. Her cries pierced the night as she mourned him. The boy had taken his last breath, leaving behind a shattered family and a father consumed by guilt. The caretaker woke up terrified, realizing the nightmare he had just experienced. But the sound of his wife's cries confirmed that this time, it wasn't a dream. He rushed out of the room and found her in the cemetery, holding their son in her arms. She wept bitterly as she cradled his lifeless body. Their son, their pride and joy, had passed away. The next day, the earth was lit by the morning sun, and preparations were made for the funeral. The caretaker held his son's body, now wrapped in the shroud, struggling to accept the bitter truth that his son was now among the dead. As he began to untie the knots of the shroud, the memory of last night's dream flashed before his eyes. It was then that he realized his son's death was no mere accident. He believed someone was behind this tragedy, and in his heart, he knew who it was. After the burial was completed, the caretaker climbed out of the grave and closed it. The mourners stood silently or wept, while the sheik recited verses of the Quran. Once the ceremony ended, the caretaker approached his wife with a burning question that had been eating away at him. "Tell me," he demanded, "what made him go out in the middle of the night to the cemetery?" His wife replied, "I was asleep, and suddenly I woke to the sound of his screams. When I ran outside to look for him, I found him where you saw us, lifeless. But I never heard him leave. He was in his bed before I went to sleep." The caretaker's suspicions deepened. He was convinced the dead man with the golden tooth from his dream was behind his son's death. However, his wife, overwhelmed with grief, couldn't entertain such thoughts. She attributed their son's passing to natural causes, never suspecting foul play. During the funeral, the same elderly woman the caretaker's wife had met at the market appeared to offer her condolences. The wife, in her despair, barely noticed her presence. After paying her respects, the old woman approached her and said, "It seems you didn't tell him what I warned you about." The wife, confused and irritated, replied, "What are you talking about? Who are you even referring to? I'm not in the state to have such a conversation right now." Isn't my grief enough for you? The old woman raised her gaze toward the caretaker and shook her head, then looked back at the wife. The wife froze, beginning to piece together the implications of the woman's words. Deep down, she suspected that her son's death might have been linked to her husband's actions. But fearing the truth and the consequences, she wanted to dismiss the old woman entirely. Frustrated, she snapped at her, "I don't know what nonsense you're spouting, old woman. Please leave us to grieve in peace." The old woman, unfazed, replied, "Did you not tell him that the dead deserve their dignity?" The wife's anger boiled over. "You're insane, rambling about nonsense. I suggest you leave us alone before I lose my patience." The old woman turned her attention to their young daughter and said ominously, "Isn't it a shame to let such a beautiful smile be buried next to the one you just laid to rest?" At that moment, the wife lost all composure and screamed, "I swear by Almighty God, if you come near my daughter, I won't rest until I've dealt with you myself." But before she could finish her threat, the old woman turned and calmly walked away. The wife, driven by a mix of rage and fear, followed her for a few steps, only to look around and find no trace of the woman. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. At that moment, the wife lost control of her emotions and exploded at the old woman, shouting, "I swear by Almighty God, if you dare approach my daughter, I will not find peace until I've dealt with you myself." Before she could finish her words, the old woman, with an unnerving calmness, turned and walked away. The wife tried to follow her, taking a few steps outside, but no matter how far she looked, the old woman had vanished as though she had dissolved into thin air. The wife held herself together until everyone had left, and night had once again settled over the cemetery. She turned to her husband, her voice trembling, and asked, "I beg you in the name of God, tell me the truth, are you the reason behind what happened to our son?" He said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. Her voice rose in desperation, "My heart always told me something terrible would come from your actions, but I never imagined it would cost me my son. My son. Do you understand the pain of losing him?" Today, during the funeral, the same old woman I met in the market came and asked me if I had delivered her message to you. This time, she warned me, no, threatened me, that our daughter would be next. The caretaker, barely able to catch his breath, stammered, "I didn't do anything. What happened to our son was the will of God. Please calm yourself, for the sake of our daughter." But his wife's gaze pierced through him, filled with accusation and heartbreak. If her eyes could speak, they would have screamed, "You killed my son." Unable to face her anymore, the caretaker avoided her gaze and retreated to his bed. But sleep was no escape. The nightmare came again. He stood helpless in the middle of the cemetery, his son's screams filling the air, echoing in every corner. He turned left and right, searching for him, but no matter how hard he looked, he could not find him. Every night it was the same dream, to the point where he began to dread sleep itself. After 2 days of torment, he made a decision. He would go to his son's grave and unearth it, to see for himself what was happening inside and put his mind at ease. That night, as before, he waited for the dead of night, carrying his lamp. He approached his son's grave, opened it, and descended the few steps into the burial chamber. What he saw froze him in place. His son's body lay exposed, his shroud torn to shreds and cast aside. His son's lifeless form looked battered, as though someone, or something, had been tormenting him even in death. Overwhelmed by grief, the caretaker cradled his son's body, clutching the tattered shroud. His tears fell freely as a voice he knew too well broke the silence. That it was the voice of the dead man with the golden tooth. He stood at the entrance to the grave, a malicious smile spreading across his face, his gaze cold enough to chill the blood. The man said, "He who betrays trust cannot expect his own trust to be kept. Isn't that right?" The caretaker's anger erupted. I did what I did to you. Leave my son out of it. He was innocent, pure-hearted. He didn't deserve this. The golden-toothed man's grin widened, his laugh echoing eerily in the small chamber, and before the caretaker could respond, he vanished into thin air. That moment, the caretaker's wife appeared at the entrance to the grave. Tears streamed down her face as she took in the sight of her husband, clutching their son's tattered shroud, his body exposed. Before he could explain, her accusations spilled out between sobs. Is this how far your evil has taken you? That you couldn't even spare your own child? The caretaker tried to calm her, pleading, wait. You don't understand, but she didn't give him a chance to explain. Her words were laced with anger and grief, blaming him for everything. All he could do was weep silently, the weight of his guilt and helplessness crushing him. Their argument was abruptly interrupted by the piercing screams of their daughter, echoing through the cold, silent night. Both parents ran toward her room, their hearts pounding with dread. When they reached the room, they found their daughter sitting upright on the bed, screaming at the top of her lungs. Sweat poured down her face, though the winter chill outside was biting. Her wide, terrified eyes were fixed on something in the corner of the room. His wife didn't give him a chance to respond. She lashed out, hurling insults and blaming him entirely for what had happened. He sat there, powerless, his tears falling like those of a broken man overwhelmed by his fate. As they argued, they suddenly heard the piercing screams of their only daughter, who had been left alone in her room. Both parents bolted toward her, fear gripping their hearts. When they entered the room, they found their daughter frozen in place, screaming loudly, her cries echoing through the house. Sweat poured from her, even though the bitter cold of winter made such a thing impossible. Her terrified eyes were fixated on something in the corner of the room. Her father was the first to see it. At first, he thought his eyes were deceiving him, but there was no denying the figure before him, a man-like entity that bore no resemblance to any human. Its grotesque face was partly covered, with only its piercing white eyes visible. Its body was hunched and deformed, with one leg that resembled a goat's hoof glinting in the dim light. The caretaker stood frozen, unable to move or speak. His wife, following close behind, gasped in horror at the sight. Without hesitation, she grabbed their daughter and clutched her tightly, shielding her eyes from the terrifying figure. The caretaker began to recite verses from the Quran, his voice trembling but determined. The figure glared at him, its presence oppressive and chilling. Yet as the caretaker's recitation grew louder, the entity slowly retreated. Its form dissipated, vanishing into the darkness of the cemetery beyond the room. When the dawn broke, the wife, furious and broken-hearted, packed her belongings and took their daughter, leaving the caretaker behind. She couldn't bear to stay another moment. I warned you, she spat bitterly, but you didn't listen. Now, I've lost my son because of your sins. I won't lose my daughter too. The caretaker didn't try to stop her. He knew she was right. Left alone, he sat for hours, replaying the events in his mind. He cursed himself for his greed and disregard for the sanctity of the dead. He thought about his son, the price paid for his sins, and wondered if the suffering would ever end. That night, as he sat alone in the darkness, he heard the creak of the door opening. Hope flickered within him, perhaps his wife and daughter had returned. But as he rushed to greet them, his heart sank. Standing there was the same grotesque figure he had seen the night before. Its misshapen body loomed over him, its chilling presence filling the air. The caretaker backed away, his feet stumbling over themselves until his back was pressed against the cold wall. He stammered, his voice trembling, Who are you? Are you human or jinn? What do you want from me? The figure's voice was low and guttural, filled with menace. You may think of me as a blend of both. I was human, but now I command the jinn. Did you not see them at my funeral, escorting my body to you for burial? The caretaker's voice shook. Were you a sorcerer? The figure laughed, a chilling sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It doesn't matter what I was. I'm not here to recount my story. I sent the old woman to warn your wife, but you refused to heed the warning. You continued to desecrate the dead. The caretaker fell to his knees, pleading. I beg you, I've stopped. My son's death was my punishment. I'll never do it again, please, just leave me alone. The figure's form twisted, becoming even more horrifying. Its face morphed into something barely recognizable, and its presence filled the room with a suffocating darkness. They all say that, it hissed, but as soon as we turn our backs, you return to your vile ways. Justice must be served, caretaker. You, who betrayed the trust of the dead, will pay the ultimate price. The caretaker's screams echoed through the cemetery, accompanied by the figure's sinister laughter. The next morning, rumors began to spread throughout the village. Some said the caretaker had left with his wife and daughter, unable to bear the grief of their loss. Others claimed to have seen him wandering the cemetery at night, a haunted man consumed by guilt. But one thing remained certain: every new caretaker brought to guard the cemetery met a gruesome and inexplicable end. Whispers spread that the caretaker's quarters were cursed, haunted by the spirits of the dead he had wronged. Kevin, the village's most pious men, those brought in to bless the quarters and cleanse them of evil, would flee in terror. They all spoke of the same thing, an unsettling sound coming from beneath the floorboards, as if something buried deep below was clawing its way out.